Restoration Theology number 4, New Testament Manuscripts and Textual Criticism. I'd like to use the analogy of a tower to talk about what we're doing in this class. Of course, every tower has a foundation and lower levels upon which upper levels rest. Because restorationists believe in biblical primacy, guess what is at the bottom of the tower? The text of Scripture. The text of the Old Testament is the bottom layer, and then the text of the New Testament is the layer that rests upon the foundation of the Old Testament. And then we build from there, and we're going to build all the way up this tower until we get to the subject of theology. So, the Bible was written originally in Hebrew for the Old Testament and Greek for the New Testament, and it was written on parchment, which is kind of durable paper made from animal skin, and papyrus, which is also a durable paper made from Egyptian reeds. It's like a reed plant that grows along the Nile River. The papyrus paper comes from that. So, scribes copied these scrolls and codices. You know what a scroll is. It's a piece of paper or papyrus or parchment that's rolled up, right? And some of our oldest stuff is a scroll, okay? But then there's also codices. Codices are where you take, it's just like a modern book, you take pages or what they call leaves and you sew them together, and that's what makes a codex, which is like an old-fashioned word for a book that we use when we talk about manuscripts. Scribes copied these scrolls and codices by hand. The Latin word for hand is manus, and the Latin word for what is written is scriptum, which is why a handwritten document is a manuscript. Because scribes occasionally made mistakes, when we look at different manuscripts, we find differences. And this is inevitable. It's not nefarious. There's no malevolence or evil intention. It just happens when you're copying by hand. You're always going to make some sort of mistakes, depending on how long it is and how diligent you are, probably how much you're paid as well. If you're getting paid more, you're more diligent. And there are differences between professional scribes and people that are a little more just evangelistic, just trying to get stuff out. And so it's important to compare manuscripts to each other and figure out the original reading. Once we do that for every verse of the Bible, where there are variations at least, we have a complete text, what we call a critical text. A critical text of the Old Testament is in Hebrew. A critical text of the New Testament is in Greek. And that is a text that is the basis for translations. And that's the next layer of the tower. So we start with the text, and then we go to translation, and then we have to go to interpretation. So let's start by talking about the New Testament. That'll be our subject for now. And then next time we'll look at the Old Testament. And I'll explain why I wanted to do the New Testament first later. Okay, but just for now, stick with me. The New Testament, to understand about the textual history of the New Testament, we have to understand about the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire was founded in 27 BC, and it fell in 476 BC. This is a map of it. The Roman Empire probably reached its greatest extent in the year 117 under Emperor Trajan. However, in 476, the western portion of the Roman Empire fell, and what was left was just the east. In this picture, it's the red, light red kind of color here. So, because the Roman Empire survived in the east, we don't call it the Roman Empire, we call it the Byzantine Empire. But those people who lived then would have still called themselves citizens of the Roman Empire, even though in 476 Rome was lost and the Italian peninsula. But because Constantine had moved the capital from Rome to Constantinople in the year 330, In the East, everything was fine, and they just kept going for another 1,000 years until the year 1453, when the Byzantine Empire finally fell. This is significant for us because the language of the Byzantine Empire, which is really just the Roman Empire that survives in the East, the language of that empire is Greek. And they are the group of people who stewarded and copied the Greek manuscripts that have survived till today that we call the Byzantine texts. The most famous example of the Byzantine text, at least for the Gospels, is Codex Alexandrinus. This comes from the 5th century, approximate date 400 to 440 AD. Over 90% of the Greek manuscripts that we have today, extant Greek manuscripts, over 90% are Byzantine texts. And that's why we also call it the majority text. So, about 70 years before the city of Rome fell to Odoacer, a man named Jerome translated the Bible from Greek into Latin. Okay, and that was a man named Jerome. When Jerome translated the Bible from Greek into Latin, at least for the New Testament, and he also from Hebrew into Latin for the Old Testament, he used Byzantine texts to do it. Those were the texts that he had available. So Jerome's Latin Vulgate becomes the standard Bible in the West, and the Byzantines are continuing to use the Greek manuscripts in the East, but they're all based on the same text type, the Byzantine text type. And for century after century, everyone just assumed that the text the churches used was the only text. Then something exciting happened called the Renaissance. This cultural movement endeavored to revive the classical period, especially Greek and Latin literature. We talked about the Renaissance before. They looked to the classical world and they wanted to learn art, literature, and philosophy from the ancients and bring them into the modern time. The Renaissance, as it turns out, was a restorationist movement. They didn't want to depend on translations. They wanted to go back to the original version of Plato or Seneca or Cicero, just to mention 3 classical authors that were popular. Scholars began looking at the original Greek and Latin versions of many documents. And so there was a man named Lorenzo Valla in the 1400s, the first half of the 1400s. He was a linguist who wanted to correct errors in the manuscripts and get back to the original. And there was a famous document called the Donation of Constantine. This document, the Donation of Constantine, was allegedly written by Constantine and basically talking about the Pope of the Church of Rome. And in this document, the Pope gives the church, not the Pope. In this document, the emperor gives the Pope authority over Rome and the whole western portion of Christianity. Popes used this document to assert their authority all over Europe. And Valla looked at this document, analyzed the Latin words and style, and he noticed that this looks like an 8th century Latin text. Constantine died in the 4th century. This is a problem. It's 400 years out of sequence with history. And he disproved the legitimacy of this document. This was a watershed moment in scholarship in the 1400s. Others saw what Valla did and got on board, and they began comparing manuscripts to each other to root out scribal errors, and also this was a forged document 400 years after the fact. So they wanted to get back to the sources as accurately as possible. The story affects the New Testament first with a man named Richard Bentley. In 1720, he proposed the first critical Greek New Testament. I have to kind of fast forward to the 1700s here because I fear I've already put too much information in here. All right, so Richard Bentley had written a proposal for printing. This is what he said in his own words. The author of this edition, observing that the printed copies of the New Testament, both of the original Greek and ancient Vulgar Latin, were taken from manuscripts of no great antiquity, such as the first editions could then procure, and now by God's providence there are manuscripts in Europe, accessible, though with great charge, above 1,000 years old in both languages, believes he may do good service to common Christianity if he publishes a new edition a new edition of the Greek and Latin, not according to the recent and interpolated copies, but as represented in the most ancient and venerable manuscripts, in Greek and Roman capital letters, uncials. To confirm the lections which the author places in the text, he makes use of the old versions, Syriac, Coptic, Gothic, and Ethiopic, and all of the fathers, Greeks and Latins, within the first 5 centuries, and he gives in his notes all the various readings, now known, within the said 5 centuries, so that the reader has under one view what the first ages of the church knew of the text, and what has crept into the copies since is of no value or authority. So that's his project. That's what he wants to do. He sends out men to find manuscripts. Richard Bentley already had Codex Alexandrinus. I already showed you a picture of that. Codex Alexandrinus was a 5th century text. It's a very old text, okay, but still from the 400s. And there's actually a funny story about him. This is from William Peterson. He says, when the King's Library, then located in Abingdon House, Westminster, burned in 1731, an eyewitness described how Bentley, then aged 69, entered the burning library clad only in his nightgown and a great wig, and emerged with this priceless Codex Alexandrinus cradled in his arms. So this text actually almost burned in a fire in a library, and he went in and rescued it. He also had access to Codex Bezae, which I'm not going to talk much about, but that was at Cambridge University Library. So what did Bentley do? According to Peterson, Bentley not only sent out his own assistants, such as Castley and Walker, but also asked the keepers of great collections throughout Europe to assist him by providing collations of important manuscripts in their charge. In collegial fashion, the scholars obliged. The most significant, quote-unquote, discovery was Codex Vaticanus, a 4th century manuscript in the Vatican Library. Now, when Bentley got access to Codex Vaticanus, this is a different manuscript. It's almost a whole New Testament. It's missing some books of the New Testament, but a majority of the New Testament. When he got access to it, he was shocked to see the difference between Vaticanus and Alexandrinus, and it kind of derailed his whole project, which he thought was going to be a little easier than it really was. Sadly, Bentley died before he was able to actually do this research and publish this book. That was his proposal that you write, that I read to you earlier, that then gets investors to invest in you, so then you have the money to do the project, then you have to sell the books and pay the investors back. So he actually never wrote the book, and he had to give the money back. So, although he didn't produce a critical text, Bentley is known as the father of New Testament textual criticism. Now, textual criticism has nothing to do about criticizing the Bible. It has to do with criticizing the manuscripts to figure out which one is likely to be the original reading, okay? Because you can have 2 different manuscripts, and in some verses, this has older readings, and in the other one, some verses, that has older readings. It's not always like, just because the paper's older doesn't mean the readings are older, okay? I don't know if that made any sense, but just stick with me. Moving on then, 1775, Johann Griesbach carried forward Bentley's vision. He identified textual families, groupings of manuscripts that had similar characteristics. Later on, these would be called Byzantine, Western, and Alexandrian families of texts. He produced critical editions of the Gospels and Epistles. His goal was to reconstruct the earliest text possible. So he carries forward Bentley's project and really starts to produce something. At this point, in the 1800s, scholars start seeking out manuscripts. They start looking far and wide for earlier and earlier New Testament manuscripts. They search university libraries and church libraries and travel to far away lands to visit ancient monasteries. And one who does that in particular is Constantine von Tischendorf, who traveled to St. Catherine's Monastery in the desert at the foot of the traditional location for Mount Sinai in Egypt. It's the oldest continuously operated Christian monastery since the 6th century. And he found Codex Sinaiticus at the monastery. And he was able to print a facsimile, a 4-volume facsimile of Codex Sinaiticus in 1862. It's the oldest, nearly complete New Testament on the planet. Found in the 1840s in a monastery in Egypt. It was a big deal. It still is a big deal. It's as old as Vaticanus, but it's got even more of the New Testament than Vaticanus has in it. Still not complete, but very close. So he published this and made Sinaiticus available to the world. And then our next steps on the journey of textual criticism is Brooke, Westcott, and Fenton Hort in the 1800s. Westcott and Hort noticed two things. One, how similar Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, these two manuscripts, how similar they were to each other. And how different they were from the majority of all the Greek manuscripts called the Byzantine texts, 90% of what we have, thousands upon thousands. They all say one thing, but then these really old ones, Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, they say something different, just a little bit different here and there. And they're like, isn't that something? Leading on Griesbach's work, Westcott and Hort developed a genealogical method. That's why I put a picture of a tree here. A tree is usually used as a metaphor for ancestors and descendants. You know, you have the original, and then you have these branches that come out from the trunk, and then branches that come out from there, and then little twigs and leaves and so forth. So it is with manuscripts. You have a manuscript. Let's say you have a manuscript of the Gospel of Luke from the year 200, or say from the year 500. It's a little more realistic. So let's say you have a manuscript of the Gospel of Luke from the year 500, and you're copying it. All right, you're copying it. Let's say it's 100 years later. It's the year 600. You're copying it, and while you're copying it, your eye, because you're reading here. You're reading here if you're right-handed, and then you copy over here, and then you read here, and then you copy over here. Right. So there's like a moment of transfer where you have to remember what you saw to go back, and then you have to remember what you just wrote to go back to where you just were reading. And so one of the problems that happens commonly for scribes is that when they come back, they remember the last word they wrote, and their eye skips to the next line or even several lines down where that same word occurs, and they start from that spot, and they basically delete in the new manuscript a whole sentence, or it could be even more. And so let's say that happens, and now 100 years later, somebody else is copying that manuscript. Now his manuscript doesn't have that data in it. It doesn't have that verse. It's missing now, right? So that's an example of how descendants can all carry forward the same traits of an earlier manuscript, just like in genealogy. Westcott and Hort, instead of merely counting manuscripts, they were trying to figure out the genealogy of manuscripts. Because here's something else. You could have a manuscript from the year 1200 AD, and you could have a manuscript from the year 700 AD. If the guy in 1200 had an accurate manuscript that he was copying from, his 1200 AD manuscript could be more accurate than somebody from 700 that was sloppy. Right? So it's really a hard problem to solve, this whole business of manuscript criticism. Westcott and Hort applied their method to figure out earlier, better readings for a particular verse. And in 1881, Brooke, Westcott, and Fenton Hort released their Greek New Testament. And what they did was they used Codex Vaticanus as the base text, and then anywhere they thought Vaticanus was in error, they used other manuscripts to fill in the differences. This was a critical text. A critical text is your best guess of what the original New Testament document said in its original language, which in this case is Greek. And then something crazy happened. In the 1890s, Bernard Grenfell and Arthur Hunt made a huge discovery. They were British papyrologists, And they thought Egypt is where the big discoveries are going to be made. So they went to Egypt, and they asked around, and they heard about this ancient town called Oxyrhynchus, and people said there were mounds there. And for archaeologists and petrologists and paleographers and so forth, a big mound is like good news. And what they found was an ancient trash site, and they started digging in this ancient landfill, and they found hundreds of thousands of Greek documents, ancient Greek documents that were just thrown out. In 3 months, they filled 280 boxes with papyri, from personal letters to grocery lists to official records to business contracts and every other kind of everyday written document, as well as copies of the New Testament and other kinds of literature. This discovery greatly improved our understanding of Koine Greek, which is the kind of Greek the New Testament was written in. And these boxes were shipped off to England. Again, 280 boxes of ancient manuscripts shipped off to England. I'm glad that ship didn't sink. It's a long way from Egypt to England, I would imagine, on an old boat in the 1800s. And in 1910, Grenfell and Hunt identified 30 New Testament fragments from these 280 boxes. Then in the 1920s to the 1950s, scholars were continuing to work through all these documents. There's so many that it would just be lifetimes to work through them. Literally hundreds of thousands of documents. And in the 1920s to the 1950s, scholars identified hundreds more of these papyri that contain parts of the New Testament. Today, there's 1,100 fragments that have been identified as parts of the New Testament from Oxyrhynchus. And more are added time to time as fragments are still discovered. I mean, the thing is, they're still going. It's 125 years later, and the majority of it is still not yet deciphered. They're still working on it. I think AI should probably help them a good deal because they have a lot of these things photographed, and there's a website, but there's only a handful of specialists on Earth that could figure out what goes to what and what does it mean. By the dawn of the 20th century, local Egyptians realized they could make money on Westerners that wanted ancient manuscripts. You got to give it to the industrious types, because they're like, all right, we see what's going on here. If we can find some papyri, we can sell it to these Europeans and these Americans, and we can make money. And so that's indeed what happened. Chester Beatty, in the year 1931, he was a New York businessman, and he had purchased from an Egyptian dealer some manuscripts. And nobody even knows where the dealer got these manuscripts. So there's ideas like maybe it came from a church, maybe it came from a grave site or something, whatever. Nobody knows. All Chester Beatty knows is that he was in the market, and there were some legit, original, ancient papyri, and so he bought them. And so did the University of Michigan. They both bought them. And in this collection that Chester Beatty bought were P45, P46, and P47. Now let me tell you about these three manuscripts. P stands for papyrus. P45 has all four Gospels and the book of Acts from the year 250. That's insane. The oldest was from the year 350 was Codex Vaticanus and Codex Sinaiticus. Vaticanus and Sinaiticus were crazy old. Now we just wound the clock back 100 years to the year 250. P46 had all of Paul's epistles and Hebrews from the year 200. And then P47 has Revelation chapters 9 through 17 from the 200s as well. So then we get the next guy, Martin Bodmer. In 1952, two Egyptians found a jar. They're digging for fertilizer, and they hit a jar, and they're like, oh, look at this, a jar, an ancient clay jar. They opened it up. They find about 30 ancient Greek papyri in the jar, and they eventually get it to a dealer, and the dealer sells it to this Swiss collector named Martin Bodmer. He purchased them. in 1952, and in that collection were P66, P72, and P75. P66 is almost a complete Gospel of John from the year 200 AD. P72 is 1st to 2nd Peter and Jude from the 3rd century, and P75 has Luke and John from 175 to 225 AD. This is just like unbelievable discoveries that are being made. And what's monumental about the Chester Beatty papyri and the Martin Bodmer papyri is that these are not like little scraps like Oxyrhynchus. You get like a little credit card sized piece of paper and you're like, oh, I think that's part of John chapter 12. No, it's not. These are hundreds of pages. Hundreds of pages. So P66 is 208 pages long. 208 leaves. I mean, these are major quality discoveries. As the 20th century rolled on, more Greek manuscripts came to light, and the more that happened, the more critical texts of the Greek New Testament were produced. A man named Eberhard Nestle produced a critical Greek New Testament called the Novum Testamentum Graeca in the year 1898. And he's really one of these founders that started something that kept going and going and going. And who knows why these things happen. But his son Erwin took over in 1913, and he revised the Nestle edition of the Greek New Testament as more manuscripts were becoming known. Then in 1952, a man named Kurt Aland got involved and added more manuscripts to the apparatus at the bottom of each page and produced a new version called the Nestle Aland 25. That was in 1963. It was already, in 1963, the 25th edition. So every edition, they're getting closer and closer to what the original Greek New Testament said. As they're comparing, now it's not even hundreds of manuscripts, now it's thousands of manuscripts that they're comparing. The Nestle Aland continued to go through revisions. By the end of the 20th century, there are 5,000 Greek manuscripts. But it's not even that simple, because we also have translations into other ancient languages. I read to you this before, but we have Gothic, Coptic, Ethiopic, Old Latin before Jerome's Latin. We have all these ancient translations that we use. But it's even more than that. Also, the church fathers would quote the Bible. And so we have all these church fathers writing. So the number of references to ancient New Testament are something like 24,000 if we add in all that other stuff, and lectionaries as well, which we're not going to get into. So in 1997, something needed to happen. The Institute for New Testament Research began using computers. Dun, dun, dun. And they developed a method called the Coherence-Based Genealogical Method, CBGM. This is like a human plus computer way of keeping track of things and figuring out which reading is more likely to be the original. This resulted in the Nestle Aland 28th edition in the year 2012, and the Nestle Aland 29th edition is due to come out this year in 2026. It should actually already be out, but I don't think it is, although I didn't check today. So, who knows? It'll come out very soon, the Nestle Aland 29th edition. Each time a new NA comes out, we use NA to refer to Nestle Aland. This is the Greek New Testament critical text. You get new English translations. And so you ask yourself, well, why do we keep having so many English translations? And why do they always have the year? So like the New American Standard Bible, first version was like 1970 something, maybe 77. And then they did it again in 95, and then they did it again in 2020. Why didn't they just get it right the first time? Well, new discoveries are being made. We're getting closer to the more ancient versions of the text, and the English language is also changing. That's another issue that happens where words start to mean different things. So each time, like I said, a new Nestle Aland edition comes out, we get a raft of new English translations, which is likely to happen in the next couple of years, as this year the 29th edition is coming out. And I suspect that AI is going to play a big role in this in the very near future as they get rid of this old system and they develop new systems that are automated and are able to comprehend and maybe not comprehend, but compare accurately many tens of thousands of texts and be able to figure out more accurately. And I think that's going to happen. All right, so that's a brief history of textual criticism of the New Testament. You can see there are these major discoveries, and then there are these groups of scholars that work together to try to figure out, okay, what is the likely to be original? I am not talking about English. I'm not talking about translations. I'm talking about the text that everyone uses to make it into English or Swahili or Chinese or German or whatever, right? That's what I'm talking about today. The text itself. All right, so what I thought I would do with the rest of the time that I have with you is look at an example, a really important example, to show you how this works in real life. So I want to look at 1 John 5, verses 7 through 8. On the left here, I have the Greek text from the Byzantine text. Okay, so it's a Greek text of 1 John 5, 7 through 8. On the right, I have a very literal translation. Okay, and I'm going to read to you just the English side of it, and it says the following. So this is 1 John 5, 7 through 8, based on the Byzantine text. It says, "For there are three who testify in the heaven, the Father, the Word, and the Holy Spirit, and these three are one. And there are three who testify on the earth, the Spirit, and the water, and the blood, and the three are in agreement." The words in the heaven, the Father, the Word, and the Holy Spirit, and these three are one, and there are three who testify on the earth, that little section right there, those words are not found in the earlier Greek manuscripts. Somebody added those words into the Bible. But they had become traditional. Ever since the Latin version, so when they started printing Greek New Testament, starting in the year 1516 and going forward from there, they're like, well, we need to, actually the 1516 version didn't have this. That's another story for another day. But 1528 version and following, after that, they all had it. Until the year 1979. In the year 1979, in the Nestle-Aland 26th edition, they removed these extra words from the main text of the Greek critical text that translators use, and instead they had it read like this: "For there are three who testify, the Spirit and the water and the blood, and the three are in agreement." I just read the white part there. You see that? That's all it says. That's all it says. But how do you know? How do I even know that? Well, probably the most in-depth way you can know is you go to this website, the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts. Thank God there's a website. This has just been developed over the last couple of decades that this work has been done. csntm.org. But scholars have traveled around the world with high-quality digital cameras and photographed all the codices, all the papyri that they could get their hands on in the museums and put them on this website. Now, a lot of museums are a little sketchy about putting pictures of their stuff on websites, so some of them will not allow it for copyright reasons, but a lot of them do. So it's kind of a mixed bag, but we do get a lot there. And so if you look up something in there, you can find Codex Sinaiticus, which I already mentioned tonight, but then finding your place where in Codex Sinaiticus is 1 John 5, 7, that's a little tricky, because you got no chapters, you got no verses, and you got no spaces between the words, and all capitals. So it's not like an easy thing to find. But I marked it there for you, so you can see, with the blue, you can see where it says, I can show you where it starts. It starts right here. It says that there are three who testify or witness, the Spirit and the water and the blood, and these three are in agreement. So it ends right about there. So this section here confirms the fact that longer section is not in it, right? But in order to do that sort of level of work, you got to not only learn Greek, but you also have to train your eye to be able to read words that have no spaces. And this one really threw me when I was trying to read this before. This letter right here actually goes to this word on the next line. And I was like, how do I get water out of this? But it's the word for water. And it looks like it's a different word here, but it's not. I was confused. So anyhow, my point is, it takes a lot of training and a lot of specialization, and this class is not assuming that you have training and specialization and PhDs and all the rest of this. This class is for normal people. So, what can you do? What's an easier way? Well, Bruce Metzger wrote the textual commentary of the Greek New Testament. It's been the definitive textual commentary of the New Testament since 1971. In this book, what it does is it just goes through all of the interesting differences between the manuscripts of the New Testament, and it cites for you which one they think is most likely to be correct, and then they give it a rating. A means they are certain it is correct. B means they're not certain it's correct. They're mostly certain. C means there's some real question here. And D means we really don't know. And there's only like 4 Ds in the whole New Testament. 4 or 5, 6, something like that. There's not very many Ds. And then they give an explanation for each one, which is really great. This recently, in the year 2025, has just been updated by Hugh Houghton, who produced it, once again, on behalf of the German Bible Society. But again, to use these resources, you have to know the Greek language. So, although it's a lot easier than actually like looking through a manuscript, it's still out of reach for most English speakers. So that's why we have the Net Bible website. netbible.org. You go to this website, you find your verse, and you read the footnote. Everything's in English. Isn't that great? Everything's in English. And I'm going to give you, here's the footnote from netbible.org on 1 John 5:7. This longer reading is found only in 10 late manuscripts, 4 of which have the words in a marginal note. These manuscripts range in date from the 10th century to the 18th. They include the following, and they list out all the manuscripts. Manuscripts have numbers or letters, one or the other. There are minor variations among these codices. The earliest manuscript, Codex 221, includes the reading in a marginal note. It means like off to the side, added sometime after the original composition. The oldest manuscripts with the comma in its text is from the 14th century. 1,400 years after Christ, we get this new verse in the Bible. This seems fishy to me, right? But the wording here departs, and so on. He goes on from there. I'm going to just skip to the end here. Thus, there is no sure evidence of this reading in any Greek manuscript until the 14th century. So, that's the Net Bible. Now, I know what you're thinking. You probably are not going to look at the manuscripts. You're not going to buy a TCG&T, the textual commentary of the Greek New Testament. And you're like, Sean, going to netbible.org, that's just too hard. Like I got to click on things and, navigate, and then I got to use my eyes and read, and this little technical. Can't we just ask AI about textual witnesses? Can't we just ask AI, what's the deal with 1 John 5:7? Yes, we can. Welcome to the 21st century, the miracle of modern technology. That's exactly what I did. I asked ChatGPT, I said, summarize for me the textual history of 1 John 5:7-8. This is what the AI spit out. 1 John 5:7-8, the Comma Johanneum, textual evidence or textual history, concise. Original text. All early Greek manuscripts, 4th to the 10th century, read a shorter form, speaking of 3 witnesses, spirit, water, and blood, with no explicit Trinitarian formula. This is the consensus of modern critical editions. Then it talked to me about the Latin, it talked to me about the Greek, it talked to me about printed Bibles and modern translations, and then I got the bottom line, which says, the shorter reading is original. The Trinitarian comma is a late Latin interpolation with minimal secondary Greek support. Boom! So here's my point. It's not that you have to go through all this stuff. Just ask your AI, right? Just ask your AI. But you still have to be able to understand what the AI is saying. If it starts talking to you about Codex Vaticanus and Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Alexandrinus, now you know that those are 4th and 5th century codices, which are a fancy word for book, handwritten New Testament. Okay? And if they start talking about papyri, now you know papyri are the really, really earliest stuff that we have. Some of them are just a scrap of paper. Some of them are 200 pages long, but they're early stuff from the 100s, the 200s, the 300s mostly. Let's review. The last 2 centuries have seen the discovery of over 5,000 Greek New Testament manuscripts. These manuscripts have many variant readings between them. Scholars, called textual critics, have developed tools to figure out which variants are likely to be original. There have been 29 major editions of the Greek New Testament as we move closer and closer to the most accurate form we can get. Resources like the TCG&T, netbible.org, and AI chatbots can tell you what variants there are for a particular verse. We live in an exciting time. Next time, we'll look at Old Testament manuscripts, and it's a totally different story with totally different characters in the story. And that we will do as we continue through our class on Restoration Theology.